If our inflation is about 2–3%, those who trade with, we should bring our inflation in line with that. There's no other way. There's nothing that Iran can do which could avoid this fundamental law. They may be able to do it over a few years because of when there are plenty of oil. I've been repeating it. I'm not saying there is no effect of oil. I'm saying that's temporary. Temporary means when you take a long enough horizon. And that's important. Politicians come in and go. Is the society and the economy has to be somehow anchored properly at the end of the day. We need an institution which anchors the inflation. Okay. Now, let me tell you how the inflation was attacked in these countries of high inflation which I've chosen. That's why I chose these countries. They were high inflation countries. And they brought the inflation down. Let's see how they did it and what the numbers are. So if you went to period 79 to 4,000, Turkey's inflation was 4.45%, which is much higher than Iran at 18%, right? Over this period, brought it down to 8%. It still had Turkey has its own problem. The 7th-year cycle of Taliban has got their own problem. The inflation may start rising in Turkey, but nevertheless they managed to bring it down. Brazil from 105% to 5%. They're also starting having problems because they haven't fundamentally solved the social contract issue, which I'm going to talk about. Mexico, 28 to 4%. Argentina, 76 to 9%. Peru, 72 to 3%. Iran, 18. These are official data. I've not invented them. I haven't decided for it to happen, but it just happened. Anybody of you can go and replicate the results. Okay, so how did they keep countries like Peru, Mexico, or to some extent Turkey and Brazil manage to do this? So what I did, I studied in detail all of the policies which was adopted in Latin America, and in Turkey to some extent, many Latin America. And firstly, found out what policies people talk about, which they think it helps, but we know it doesn't work. Because it's important, in any disease, diagnostic and remedy, you need to know what doesn't work, or what we tried and other people didn't work. So it turns out that there are a lot of methods. I don't want to go into that because there's more academic. But there are methods people talked about. You say, who cares about inflation? Why do you care about inflation? Why don't we index wages to go in line with inflation? Inflation is at 20%. Let's increase wages by 20%. Let's do everything systematically. Every month we look at what inflation was 5%. We jack up everybody's income by the same. Who cares? The problem is that it doesn't mean we stay there. It could accelerate. That become hyperinflation. We know about hyperinflation. The Germans know about hyperinflation. The Hungarians know about hyperinflation. Iranians don't know about hyperinflation. Historically, if you look at data of Iran over the 100 years, they had only 1 year of 100% inflation. That was the Second World War, when the British and the Russians invaded Iran to take the goods from Iran into the Lenin, then it was a Stalingrad to help the war. So suddenly the demand on goods in Iran went up, inflation went up, and it came back after the war ended, back down. So we never had any hyperinflation. So definitely you don't want to follow methods which not only doesn't solve the problem, it's going to have a danger of hyperinflation. It's a crazy thing to do. So I hear this upset, by the way, still in Iran. So then there are other methods. These are nothing to do with Iran, because Iran doesn't tax people that much. But there is an issue that if you have hyperinflation, the government should tax people more quickly. Because if the inflation is rising and I tax you every year, I don't get as much out of you if I tax you every day. So there are methods, but there are problems. And then there is other issues. How do we use monetary policy to deal with this problem? None of them seem to work. Now the key actually is that who solved the problem, well, this guy, Gustav Franco, who was the governor of Central Bank of Brazil during this period, he managed to bring inflation down, was that he realized the following, which I think is very important in the case of Iran. That's why I quoted it in red. He said, people and their political representatives. The reason he says the word political representative, it doesn't mean it doesn't have to be dictatorial for inflation to become endemic. The political representative of the people wanted to give themselves things they could not afford. He found this is the source of the problem. In other words, all of us here, we sit together, democratically or otherwise, through welfare state, whatever, we all decide that we want this, we want that, we want the other, but then we don't recognize all of us together that there is not enough productive capacity in the economy, the way we run the economy, to supply all the goods we need. So we have to borrow from the rest of the world. We have to keep borrowing, keep borrowing. So basically, this was his problem, and he took draconian action in order to deal with the problem. In fact, they set up a three-man committee, which was himself, the governor of central bank, the foreign ministry, and the minister of industry, and they bypassed the whole of the representative parliament in Brazil. They decided that they got their approval, and the approval of the president, they need to basically cut down the demands, because if they relied on the parliament, they would then have different vested interest group would come and ask for different packages for themselves, which then escalate, and they couldn't manage it. So they tried to break that. That's how they did it. I'm not saying that in the case of Iran, this is what you should do, but I'm just telling how the Brazilian approached the problem after many years of experimentation with different methods. So it basically is to do with the social contract. Now, in the case of Iran, basically, a lot of those policies may not be relevant, like dollarization was another one. For example, in Argentina, the inflation was so bad, and the currency crisis was so endemic, they decided to actually abandon the currency and use dollars instead. But I don't think Iran in that situation. Doesn't mean that whether you have a relation with America or not, because you can use another unit of account. So what you need, I've written here, you need a social contract. In Iran, you need a new social contract, a new understanding of how the society creates wealth and production, and how it gets distributed. This is broken down in Iran. People think this is their right. Oil, money somehow become a right. When you talk to people, this become a right, and that there is everybody has got their own group, vested interest group, which actually intervene on their behalf, either directly or indirectly. It could be military groups, it could be paramilitary, or it could be vested interest in the bazaar or within the intelligentsia. There are certain groups that operate in that. Of course, this is also subject to issues of corruption. I'll come back to discuss that a little bit more in the context of how Ahmadinejad operated this system and how it led to the problem become accentuated. So be careful. I'm not saying all the things was his fault. He accentuated it and got it into crisis mode. So basically, the other problem Iran has, which is really important, is volatility of oil export revenues. In Iran, oil prices is volatile, right? Oil prices go up and down. But in the case of Iran, the volatility is not just oil prices. It's the actual export earning you have is very volatile, because of the fact that we don't have a good relation with the rest of the world. So your export earning, the export in the rest of the world suddenly get cut down, go up. It's very random. During the war, our export was almost came to halt in some periods, almost. So basically, there's a huge volatility come from export, and then oil prices are volatile. When you multiply them by each other, the earning that the government has or the Iranian people have from oil is not as stable. It gyrates quite a bit. Why is it important? The importance of it is that if something gyrates a lot, it means that you have to be very careful how you rely on it. If you rely on it when it goes up, you think, oh, you got it forever, right? You try to invest and try to use it, and then before you know it goes down and you are in trouble. So what you need to smooth the fluctuation. That's why I call shock absorber. Iran needs better shock absorber. I'll come to that again. How Iran has been creating that. Of course, there is a sanction as well that we have to bear in mind. Now, these basically intensification of sanctions came basically at the time that Iran was least prepared to deal with this sanction. So the effect of sanction magnified, and like an avalanche, it unleashed the avalanche much more quickly and erupted basically very quickly. But then the source of the cause of the problem was building up, as I already indicated. So I've actually developed a model, a global model where you can shock Iranian oil, because Iran is very small to the world, you can actually reduce the Iranian oil and see what happens. Often what happens is Saudi Arabia oil production goes up, oil prices doesn't change very much, and Iran suffers, mainly the production. There's some data here. This is the effect of shock of a sanction by the magnitude which was observed. It's quite interesting. This is a theoretical empirical model, but what it shows that there's the blue one, it shows how much production fell in Iran, would have fallen in Iran as a result of the sanction. You know, by the way we did it, I've done it with Kamil Mahades. There's a paper which we're presenting next year in a conference on Iran in Boston. So what we do, we have a global model. Iran is one of those models. So then we bring down the production of oil in Iran from whatever it is by 50% down. And then we look at what the effect of it is on the Iranian economy and the rest of the world. If it turns out the rest of the world doesn't get affected by that much, because Iran is that small, so it's not important. That's why Americans went ahead with this, because they realized it has very little effect on the rest of the world economy. And then what happens that the effect of it comes when production falls. These are quarterly rates, so when production falls in a steady state after 2 years, these are quarters. It tells you about the timing of it. Between 2 years, it falls by 2% per quarter, or 1 point, if you go up earlier, it would be about 1.6% per quarter. If you take 2% per quarter, multiply by 4 to get an annual rate, you get 8%, and we already got 5.6% the first year. So this year it's going to fall by another 2%, basically matches the 8% here. Now, what happens the effect of sanction on inflation? It goes up, but nothing as much. So this is the effect of sanction inflation. So therefore, the theoretical model also shows that sanction would increase inflation. So it could be the reason for stagflation, that output's fallen, inflation risen. But notice the red lines cover the zero. It means that the effect is not statistically significant. It means that it's not that important as well. But if you look at the effect of the sanction on production, notice here that the red lines clear the zero, which basically means is way below zero, for sure, by property calculus. Okay. So the evidence. What about the effect on real exchange rate? Nothing. Because the PPP controls that at the end of the day, in the long run. And what about oil prices? Nothing. Again, the zero line is in between the red line. If anything, it says oil price will go down a little bit. But obviously it's not significant statistically, so it's very little effect. So what is the effect of sanction? Reduces the production. Okay. It's what we observe. Remember I showed you the data? It matches this. That's a theoretical model. So people say this technique doesn't work in the case of Iran. Every time I do that, it works much better in Iran. So it's a lesson to the young people that maybe they should take this into account. So just to go along these things, so what we need to do, obviously sanction is going to have negative, it makes everything difficult, becomes more accentuated, prolong the problem to move out of that. But the longer the sanction is in place, the less it becomes effective, because the economies find a way out of it. But there is a cost all the time. Now, policies to counter the effect of sanction obviously are critical because they help you to avoid some of the negative effects of the sanction. What you need to do? Obviously, you need to basically expand the productive sector more, promote non-oil export, especially tourism. I indicated in Iran that you really need to expand tourism because tourism is an area which sanction cannot